Hello, and welcome to this special pre-recorded event for the Postgraduate Diploma in Asian Art at SOAS University of London. My name is Malcolm McNeill, and I have the privilege of being the director of this programme. And today I'd like to welcome you to a very special three-part series of presentations showcasing just some of the topics and the ranges of expertise that contribute to our Chinese art module, which begins this coming year, 2021, on the 11th of January. And our first speaker today is my colleague, Dr. Stacey Pierson, who's a reader in the history of Chinese ceramics here at SOAS, as well as Ivy Chan, my former colleague from Christie's in London, who is on the cusp of submitting her doctorate in the history of collecting Chinese ceramics, and who is currently working as an independent researcher specialising in Chinese ceramics and works of art. The first presentation today will be from Stacey, the second will be from Ivy, and I will give you the concluding presentation, covering a range of materials, giving you an indication of the breadth of topics that we cover within the SOAS Postgraduate Diploma in Asian Arts Chinese Art module, the next iteration of which will be available online from the 11th of January 2021. And I'll now hand over to Stacey.
Thank you, Malcolm. The most important objects in my field are a pair of porcelain vessels that were made in the 14th century. They were commissioned in 1351 by a man named Zhang Yuanjin, who commissioned them as part of a set from a factory in South China in a location known as Jingdezhen, which is still the home of porcelain production today. Why did he commission these? Well, he said very helpfully in the inscription that is painted on this pair of vessels that he commissioned them as a prayer for the protection and blessing of the whole family and for the peace of his sons and daughters. So essentially, he wanted to dedicate these vessels to a temple in order to gain a blessing and a blessing for prosperity for his family and his children. Now, this meant that these vessels were a type of object known as altar vessels. And there's a long history of presenting and displaying vessels in temples in China. Many of them were made of materials like lacquer, wood, or metalwork. But by the 14th century, they were becoming more and more popular in ceramic. And the two vessels were part of a set of three. Now, the third piece in the set has never surfaced, but it may have looked something like this piece here, which is of the right shape and the right time period, but in a different type of ceramic. Now, sets of three altar vessels were also newly fashionable in the year in which this pair was made. Now, Zhang Yuanjin was an early adopter in another way, because these vessels were also made in a new style. And that style is known as blue and white porcelain, and it's made by painting cobalt onto the porcelain, covering it with a clear glaze, and then firing it. So what you're left with is what's known as underglaze blue painting. And you can see a sample of cobalt here and its bright blue color, as well as the finished piece from the later part of the Xuande period in the early Ming Dynasty. So what happened after he dedicated the pieces to this temple and presented them? Well, it appears that they remained in a temple for over 500 years, and it may or may not have been the temple that you can see here, which is in Jiangxi province. However, by the early 1900s, they had come onto the art market. And that was the result of Europe and Britain's diplomatic relationship with China starting to deteriorate in the mid-19th century. And this incorporated the Opium Wars from the 1840s, as well as the Taiping Rebellion, which is a civil war from 1850. So because of this, a huge amount of disruption, it's possible that the temple needed money, and they may have sold them off along with other objects to raise funds for the maintenance of the temple and its activities. But once they came onto the market, they were purchased by a total of 4 British men. One of them was owned by the collector William Cleverly Alexander, who died in 1916, and then his collection, much of it came up for sale, and it was purchased by another collector, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, who happened to be a very good friend of a collector named Percival David, who bought this piece from Elphinstone in 1927. The second piece was owned by Charles Russell, whose collection was mostly sold off at auction in 1935. And at this auction, David then purchased the second piece. So by 1935, he had reunited them. And it was at this stage that they were transformed into these new iconic objects, which are today known as the David vases. And really, as soon as they were reunited by David, they began to be published in every book on or referencing Chinese blue and white porcelain. In one book by Harry Garner of 1954, he said, "The David vases are now clearly established as providing the most important landmark in the early history of blue and white." And his colleague Sohn Jennings, in his book Ming Pottery and Porcelains, described them as a single lighthouse in a troubled sea. So why were they making these fairly grandiose comments about a pair of porcelain vases? Well, they were admired at that time because there had been advances in scholarship on Chinese ceramics since the time that the vessels were first published in English in 1927. At that time, it was not believed that blue and white porcelain could have been made at such an early date in the mid 14th century. So there were advances in scholarship that helped to recognize the importance of these pieces. They were also brought back together as a pair, which collectively made them more significant. Plus, they were owned by Percival David, who was a famous collector in his lifetime and is still today considered one of the most important collectors of Chinese ceramics. And he had installed them in his new museum, which opened at SOAS to the public in 1952. But most importantly is the fact that these are rare. There are no others like them, and they are dated by inscription. So dating is the most important aspect of them because it ensures that they are in fact the earliest dated blue and white porcelains in the world. So that means that they're very important in porcelain studies, but as well as collecting, because they are a benchmark for the production of Chinese blue and white and for the dating of all other blue and white. This collecting by David and subsequent scholarship and presentation in the museum really transformed these into new objects. So today they have this new identity as the first blue and white, as well as the David vases. And more broadly, they are in fact dated Yuan period Chinese objects. So you will also see them illustrated and referenced in any book on the history of Chinese art, and in particular, the history of Yuan period Chinese art. And they are so significant, in fact, that even the royal family appreciated them. As you can see from the visit to David's museum, which was at SOAS in the building at 53 Gordon Square, in May of 1973. So here you see the Queen Mother visiting the second floor galleries where these were installed, and she's very clearly looking at and in fact touching one of the David vases. And the newspaper report said that these are the earliest pieces of the exhibit dating back to 1351. So their significant date was also mentioned in this newspaper. Interestingly, their story doesn't stop here though, because David's museum closed in 2007 and the whole collection was moved to its new location, which is in the British Museum. So this Percival David collection is housed in a dedicated gallery, and the David vases themselves are on display in a dedicated case. So they have a new identity that's now associated with another place, the British Museum. And in this location, they have become even more widely published and of course more widely viewed, both online and by Chinese visitors and in Chinese language. They are also perhaps the most frequently faked examples of blue and white porcelain in the world, and I'm just showing a couple examples of some of the many fakes I've seen of these iconic pieces. But I think maybe the ultimate accolade for this pair of vases made in 14th century China was their inclusion in the British Museum project, A History of the World in 100 Objects, which seems to solidify their status as the most important blue and white porcelain, but also arguably the most important dated ceramics in the world.
Thank you so much, Stacey, for such an in-depth, focused discussion of these iconic pieces. I'll now hand over to Ivy for the second presentation in this session.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. So moving on from blue and white porcelain, I'm going to guide you towards a slightly more esoteric subject now, which is Chinese bamboo carving. Bamboo is a fast-growing plant that is native to China, and you might be surprised to know that it is in fact a type of grass, not tree. It prefers the warmer climate of southern China, which is why the main centers for bamboo carving were in Suzhou, Shanghai, and Nanjing, where craftsmen could easily source the material. Bamboo carvings such as brush pots and wrist rests are very useful objects for a Chinese scholar's desk, but they also serve decorative and meditative purposes, which made them very popular amongst the literati of the Ming period. Before I discuss this particular brush pot in more detail, I'd like to quickly stress that the theme of bamboo itself is one of the most widely depicted subjects in Chinese art. The Song Dynasty painter-poets Wen Tong and Su Shi both excelled in ink painting illustrating bamboo, which became a major genre in Chinese painting. Here's one example showing overlapping bamboo leaves painted by Wen Tong. Bamboo is highly celebrated by Chinese scholars as a symbol of a true virtuous gentleman. When the wind is strong, the bamboo bends but never breaks. It represents integrity, resilience, and humility. Here we have an 18th century celadon glazed vase shaped as bamboo in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum. You can see from this model that the structure of bamboo is like a tube. The interior is hollow. Now, the term for hollow interior in Chinese is xu xin, which is actually the same term for humility or modesty. Apart from this, bamboo is often combined with other plants to represent certain symbolic meanings. The combination of pine, bamboo, and prunus is known as the three friends of winter, as they all thrive during the colder months of the year and signify perseverance. This here is an example of the subject in Ming painting. On the other hand, bamboo, prunus, orchid, and chrysanthemum flowers are together known as the four gentlemen: proud, dignified, elegant, and pure. So what about actual bamboo objects? Well, one of the earliest known examples of bamboo being used in China is a bamboo spearhead dating to around 3,500 to 4,000 BC. This was unearthed from a Neolithic site near Changzhou in Jiangsu. And in terms of early examples of bamboo carved with decorative designs, there is a lacquered bamboo ladle with a dragon design, which was found in a Han tomb in Mawangdui in Changsha in Hunan, dating to the 2nd century BC. Now, there are two main parts of bamboo which are most commonly used for carving. Firstly, the root, an example of which I'm showing here, and secondly, the long stem. This brush pot in the National Palace Museum is carved from the stem of bamboo. Illustrated around the cylindrical form is a scene from the Romance of the Western Chamber. This is a famous story set in the Tang Dynasty, which was written by a Yuan Dynasty playwright who actually adapted the story from an earlier short story by a Tang Dynasty writer. On this brush pot, we can see the female protagonist of the story called Cui Yingying. If we look at all sides of the brush pot, we can see that she is shown here reading a letter in front of a dividing screen, while her maid, Hong Yang, peeks out from behind the screen to spy on her. The composition of this scene is based on a woodcut illustration by Chen Hongshou, but the bamboo carver actually made some adjustments to this to suit the bamboo surface better. The way in which the carver manipulates the surface to portray various levels of depth is very impressive here. You can also see that the carver made finer incisions to show the decoration on the screen. Now, if we look closer at this dividing screen, we can see that there is actually a signature cleverly hidden in one corner, as if it is part of the design on the screen. The two characters read San Song, referring to the famous bamboo carver Zhu Sansong, who was also known as Zhu Zhizheng. Zhu was active during the Wanli period in the late 16th to early 17th century, and it is believed that he died just after the beginning of the Qing dynasty in 1644. This brush pot is certainly one of his most representative works that we know of today. So what does this bamboo brush pot signify in terms of the wider development of bamboo carving? Well, Zhu came from a family of distinguished bamboo carvers based in the Jiading area in Shanghai. His father, Zhu Ying, was also known as Zhu Xiaosong, and his grandfather was Zhu He, also known as Zhu Songlin. Now, these three generations of the Zhu family are classified by later bamboo carving connoisseurs as representatives of the Jiading school of bamboo carving. Zhu He, or Zhu Songlin, excelled in deep relief carving, and he is considered to be the pioneer of this Jiading school. He was active in the mid-Ming period around the Zhengde and Jiajing reigns in the 16th century. This was the time when bamboo carving flourished, particularly in Wuzhong in Suzhou and its surrounding areas. Ming scholars who were accomplished in poetry, calligraphy, painting and seal carving began to turn to bamboo carving and made it a respected art form. By the late Ming period, the two main centers for bamboo carving were Jiading and Jinling, which is modern-day Nanjing. While the Jiading style shows fine, intricate carvings with deep relief patterns, the Jinling style is characterized by simpler, shallow, low relief carving with a strong focus on lines. Although bamboo carving continued in the Qing dynasty and we still have some active bamboo carvers in China today, it seems that the height of literati bamboo carving was in the Ming period, and the quality of this brush pot truly demonstrates that.
Thank you, Ivy, for such an insightful and focused examination of that single object from the collection of the National Palace Museum in Taipei. And I find it particularly interesting to move on from there, as it has so many painterly illusions embedded in this, this carved piece of bamboo. This connection between materials, artistic processes, and artistic ideas is something we very much engage with in the courses that we offer on the postgraduate diploma in Asian art, but particularly in our Chinese art module, as I hope you will see as I go on to the next part of our presentations today, to give you an introduction to an individual painting from the early Ming dynasty, an elegant gathering in the Apricot Garden. Now, this painting in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York is after Xie Huan, a leading court painter of the mid-15th century. Now, what is possibly the original or first version of this painting that the artist created is now in the collection of the Zhenjiang Museum of Zhenjiang Provincial Museum in mainland China. However, I've chosen to focus on this work in the Met for two reasons. One is because this is an object which has better high resolution images available to us to study. And the other is because I had the privilege of working quite closely on this subject when I was the project curator, or the interim project curator, and then a researcher for the exhibition Ming 50 Years That Changed China at the British Museum. And now this painting that we'll be discussing today is centered not so much on a single moment, but on a single day, a single meeting or gathering, which took place on the first day of the third lunar month of 1437. And it featured 9 prominent individuals, senior scholar officials, all originating from South China, but all serving at the Ming court in Beijing. And it was hosted by the figure we see in the red robe on the left-hand side of this first slide, Yang Rong. Now, Yang was one of 3 men surnamed Yang who held very senior positions at the early Ming court. And among his illustrious colleagues, and indeed his illustrious guests at this gathering, were Yang Shiqi and Yang Pu. And all of them were senior advisors whose careers spanned the reign of 4 different emperors in the early Ming period. Now, over the course of the next few minutes, we'll discuss this painting as a work of art, as a seminal example of the mastery of brush and ink and colour on silk from the early Ming period. We'll also look at it briefly as a political document, as something that tells us a bit more about the machinations of power and sort of the gatherings that cemented those relationships of power that were axle to the operations of the Ming court in the early 15th century. But also drawing on the material culture, the things that we see in the painting, as well as the people, we'll look into the world of the early Ming elite and the aesthetic pursuits that they took part in, which were not only tangentially adjacent to, but intimately connected with the political networks that they moved within. That relationship between culture and politics being a seminal facet of early Ming painting and early Ming courtly life. So let's move on to look at the painting itself. Now, this painting is in the format of a hand scroll, which means it is read from right to left, unrolling section by section. And in this first section here, we see the first 2 guests, or in fact, perhaps the last 2 guests arriving at this gathering in the garden of Yang Rong. And reminding us immediately of Ivy's presentation, we see a thicket of this almost turquoise kingfisher green bamboo in the upper register of the painting. The 2 figures we see here have likely walked in from the right-hand side of the image, or perhaps progressed down this path that we see in the upper right-hand corner. The titular apricot blossoms are visible in the tree in the upper right corner, and indeed in the branches reaching up from the lower register of the painting. Now, in this hand scroll format, space, although continuously moving from right to left, is frequently divided by the insertion of these pictorial devices, such as we see here in the deciduous thicket of trees with a deer peering around from the edge of them, that separates this initial arrival scene from the more intimate sections of the gathering that we move on to here. And here we now see the 3rd guest at the gathering, walking alone and about to join the main grouping at the centre of the painting. And before we focus on the individuals attending this event, we see in this scene a key series of intimate examples of the rich and sumptuous material culture of Yang Rong's garden. Now, that's not only in the sumptuous nature of the plants, the bamboos, the pine trees, the rocks and flowers that we find within this space, but indeed the furnishings, the addition of porcelains, of metalwork. If you look closely at this painting, you can even see a lacquer table in the upper right-hand corner. All of this rich series of sumptuous objects reminds us of the status of the space into which we are entering. But it's not just about wealth, power and prestige. There are other more specific allusions that we can see here. For example, the choice of objects that one might find. Looking at this table immediately behind the sitter's shoulders, you see these 2 small pots placed upon it. These are likely containers for go or weiqi, encirclement chess, the kind of black and white stones that are used to play this strategic game, and were a kind of a mechanism for demonstrating one's strategic competence, even as a civil official and not a military official. When we look at the back of this this scene, we again see this bright red table, which is likely a product of the Imperial Lacquer Workshop in Beijing, a reminder that not only are these objects an indication of wealth, but also of status of access to the finest things in the empire, and an access that was facilitated by the political positions of the key figures at this gathering that we see here in the next slide. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the three figures who sit most prominently within this group of 9 attendants at this gathering were Yang Rong, Yang Shiqi, and Yang Pu. Before we break down the identities of the sitters in this part of the painting, I want to focus for a moment on the ways in which authority is communicated to us by the artist. How do we know who stands out most amongst this grouping? And it's partly to do with physical positioning. The figure seated at the centre here, who sits with this enormous Taihu rock behind him, this porous set of surfaces which we can actually peer through and see the blossoming flowers and leaves behind. There are further reminders of the material wealth of the host in further lacquer furniture, a lacquer stool and table on the right-hand side, this tame crane that we find on the lower right of the painting, and indeed the profusion of servants who surround them, bringing them accoutrements for their cultural pursuits, a roll of scrolls in the servant on the right-hand side, just to the left-hand side of the central sitter, and indeed the servant on the left arranging the various accoutrements of scholarly pursuits, brushes, an inkstone and an incense burner on the table on the left. But who is it who will be utilising these instruments of scholarly pursuits? And we can see their names here now appearing on the slide. In fact, it's quite important to note that the host, Yang Rong, has not taken the traditional central seat in this gathering. Instead, he sits to the left of Yang Shiqi. And while these two figures are of equal rank within the imperial bureaucratic hierarchy, Yang Shiqi was perhaps slightly more influential and powerful within this closely connected coterie of officials, as he had been the personal tutor to 2 of the preceding emperors, to the Hongxi Emperor and the Xuande Emperor. So we see here the centrality of this figure represented not only by his positioning, but the positioning of objects around him and behind him. To go back to that rock, the Taihu porous rock, that comes from, or has likely been shipped to the capital from, Lake Tai itself, which in fact is a major cultural landmark within Yang Shiqi's home province. Now, when we look slightly out from the sitters here and think about the mechanism through which power was exercised in early Ming China, I want to focus on 2 perhaps marginal objects that appear within the painting. We see there are 3 scholar officials here, Yang Rong, Yang Shiqi, and Wang Zhi, all of them senior figures within the civil bureaucracy. But the bureaucracy operates through the communication of the bureaucrats' writings, the scholar officials' writing of memorials, the issuing of communiques, either memorials to the emperor entreating a particular kind of action, or writing a declaration or correspondence that would shape the implementation of a policy in their home region or at court. And here, that agency, that function of the civil official is implied not solely by their physical presence, but also by the brushes that appear in the painting. And interestingly, the 2 sitters in the centre on the left are the closest to the brushes that appear within the painting. And indeed, there is no third brush, a reminder of the particular space, position of seniority that Yang Rong and Yang Shiqi occupied in the early Ming court. As we move on, we see further examples within the painting of cultural pursuits conducted in this elegant gathering. Here, a very active engagement in culture, not the sort of implied latent potential of the Weiqi board behind the guest arriving in the early section, nor the as yet untouched brushes to the left of Yang Rong and Yang Shiqi. Instead, here with these 3 groups of this group of 3 sitters, we see Yang Pu at the centre, the 3rd of the 3 Yangs, alongside his fellow scholar official of the same rank, Wang Ying, together admiring a landscape painting, a kind of reminder that we are in this aestheticized space of the garden through another simulated landscape of the landscape within the painting here, subtly indicated to us with a small corner on the lower left of the painting visible as Wang Ying holds the lower stave of the hand scroll, admiring it with Yang Pu peering over his shoulder in this shared act of cultural erudition. And so to step back for a second from the painting that we're looking at here, the particular narrative unfolding on the silk before us, and to think about what this tells us in a broader sense about the place of painting within early Ming society, It's a reminder that the elite in this period were not necessarily expected to be painters themselves, but instead to actively participate in the appreciation, connoisseurship, and appraisal of painting. Whereas calligraphy, as illustrated by Qian Xili on the right-hand side of this grouping, was very much an active pursuit and a mandatory skill to be mastered by the participants in these kinds of gatherings. So now we want to move on to the final section of the painting, perhaps a kind of a postscript following these politically loaded gatherings of senior officials that we found in the earlier sections, to close with this short scene that shows the wine being served and moving towards the guests within the gathering, a reminder of a kind of subtle way in which time can be manipulated and presented within these paintings. While we've seen initially a group of people arriving at the gathering, then moving into the kind of active setting up of positioning of people within the various groups in which they would sit, into the active participation in cultural pursuits, we now see the serving of intoxicants, and that perhaps implies the end of the evening, the latter stage of this more sociable and uninhibited kind of engagement that would likely be accompanied by poetic composition, as well as further kind of machinations and conversations going late into the evening in this gathering. And as a final section, just to think about what this object is as a composite artwork, moving away from the painting service, I want to give you an indication of the postscripts that would follow this in calligraphy. Here, an inscription from the senior scholar official Yang Shiqi, as we noted, the most prominently positioned of the three Yangs within this painting. And in this lengthy inscription describing the scene that unfolds in the preceding painting, he gives us a quote from the Book of Poetry, this classic of great antiquity in China, still drawn on by scholar officials in the early Ming as a kind of focal point for the relationship between poetry, literature and politics, a key text for them to master and understand in advancing their scholar official careers. And this quote, as provided by Yang, reads as follows: "Gentlemen of ancient times, even when at leisure, would not pass a single day when they forgot the state and the empire." So a reminder that these figures gathered here, though they may appear to be engaged in cultural pursuits that are perhaps a bit removed from the machinations of state or their duties as servitors to the emperor, they are nonetheless always mindful of this principle passed down from deep antiquity, that they have a continuous duty to the state, and perhaps implicitly that their social interactions are indeed another form of politics that were clearly powerful and influential in this axal moment in 1437 when this gathering took place, when the Zhengtong emperor, an 11-year-old boy at that time, was only just appointed to the throne within the past 2 years. And indeed, the fate of the Ming Empire was very much resting in the hands and on the shoulders, to some extent, of these three senior scholar officials we've seen in this painting. So that concludes today's three presentations on three individual objects, or in one case, a pair of objects, connected to the arts of China. A showcase of the expertise and the range of materials covered in the SOAS Postgraduate Diploma in Asian Arts Chinese Art module, which begins on the 11th of January 2021, available online wherever you may be in the world. And I'd really like to thank Stacey and Ivy for their in-depth, focused examinations of these topics that connect not only to our full-time module, but also to a forthcoming short course that Ivy has curated for us, and which will be running weekly on Fridays from the 22nd of January to the 12th of March, including, amongst other leading experts in the field, Stacey Pierson's contributions to the lecture programme that we will be hosting. So if you'd like to find out about any more of our forthcoming programmes, be it our full-time module or our short courses, then don't hesitate to get in touch either with me directly on mm133@soas.ac.uk or to contact my colleague Patrick Munger, the Diplomas Manager, at asianart@soas.ac.uk. Thank you very much again for your time, and we look forward to seeing you at one of our courses in the near future.